Welcome to my easy-to-follow method for making your own sourdough starter. Before we begin, I'll quickly explain the tools and ingredients you will need to begin. The first thing you need is a kitchen scale. I've seen so many people online upset that they cannot create a starter, and half the time it's because they are measuring by volume instead of weight. I have a video on my channel about the importance of a scale and why trying to measure with cups and tablespoons will make your sourdough journey unnecessarily difficult. It will be the best $15 you'll ever spend. Next, you'll need a container. Any container will do. You can even use a drinking glass if you like, and just cover it with cling film, but in this video I'll use my mason jar. Next is flour. Starters don't like bleach, so be sure it's unbleached flour. I recommend resisting the temptation of speeding up your starter's growth by adding other flours. It's like feeding a baby sweets for the first time. Once they get the taste for it, it's hard for them to return to eating mushy peas. So start as you mean to go on and stick to one flour. No need to make this more difficult or more expensive than it needs to be. Although if you're determined to have a rye starter, you can use the same method with rye. Sourdough starters typically respond much better to flours with higher protein. Now, I live in Canada, and all of our all-purpose flours are pretty high in protein. You can see here that there are 4 grams of protein per 30 grams of flour. Now, when bakers talk about protein content, they base it on 100 grams of flour. So we must calculate how much protein goes in 100 grams. 30 into 100 goes 3.333 times. 4 times 3.33 is 13.3. So 13.3 is our protein content in this flour. In some countries, all-purpose has way less protein. So if you have a low-protein all-purpose, you may want to make a starter using bread flour, which typically has a higher protein content. And lastly, you require non-chlorinated water. Starters don't like chlorine. So there are 2 ways of achieving this. You can fill up a big jug or container with tap water and put it in the fridge uncovered for about 24 hours. The chlorine will evaporate. And the other, easier method is using filtered water. I use a Brita jug with a filter, or you can just use some bottled water. Place your container on your scale and press tare. Pour in 25 grams of your non-chlorinated water. Press tare on your scale again and add 25 grams of your unbleached flour. Then give this mixture a really good stir. I'll speed it up for you. Now, when you've stirred it really well, you'll see you have the consistency of a thick paste. And this is what we're looking for. So you're just going to cover up this container. Do not seal it. You just want to loosely place a lid on it or cover it with a bit of saran wrap. You're going to leave it sitting on your counter for 24 hours. And we'll come back tomorrow. It has now been 24 hours, and you can see that the flour mixture has a few bubbles, and it has relaxed a bit. Now, you are going to add 25 grams of flour and 25 grams of water to this mixture, and then give it a good stir. Your starter is basically a fermented culture of flour and water. The mixture will begin to ferment with the help of bacteria and natural yeasts from the environment. Now we just cover this up and put it on the counter for another 24 hours. We are back on day 3. You can see our starter began to grow over the past 24 hours and went up to about here yesterday. It finished eating the food or flour and started to fall back down. And this is what we have left. It is liquidy and has some bubbles. Now we're going to begin doing something called discarding. Before we feed our starter again, we will want to remove some of it and either put it in the garbage or pour it into a container, fill it up with water, stir it, and pour it down the sink. You never want to pour starter directly into the sink. It'll start clogging up your pipes. So here you see me pouring out some of my starter into another container, and I'm going to discard that. Now, to the remaining starter, we will feed it 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour, and then give it a good stir. We are going to begin to measure any growth that happens by marking the container of where the level of the starter is with a marker or putting an elastic band around it. And then we will check to see tomorrow whether or not it grew. Once you're done this, cover it up, put it on the counter, and we'll see you in 24 hours. And you'll notice the top of my jar is now clean. That's just because between takes I wiped down the sides with some paper towel. Okay, it has been 24 hours and it is now day 4. Our starter grew just a little bit and it absolutely smells foul. Don't worry about that. Just discard about half of it and then feed it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. If you go a little bit over in flour like I'm doing in this clip, don't worry about it. It's just more food for the starter. You don't have to be too exact at this point. So just stir it up and we're going to leave it for another 24 hours. Okay, day 5. We've had absolutely no growth in our starter, but that is completely normal. Once it bubbles up at the very beginning and you think you've got something going, but you don't because it'll just die down. But that's okay. We're just going to keep discarding and feeding. I'm going to take the starter and pour 50 grams of it into a brand new clean container. By day 5 or before, you should probably change out your container every few days. Once I pour 50 grams of the starter in, I am now going to pour 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. You may have noticed in this clip, I accidentally poured out 53 grams of starter instead of 50. That's okay. You just want to make sure you match it with 53 grams of water and 53 grams of flour. Now we'll see you in another 24 hours. Okay, day 6. We still didn't get any rise, but that's okay. So we're just going to discard and then we're going to feed it again. So we're going to feed it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. I'll speed that up. Okay, you can see I have a bit of a mess up the side of my container, so we're just going to give it a little clean with some paper towel. And then we're going to cover it and see you again in 24 hours. Okay, day 7. And as you can see here, our starter is alive. It has more than doubled and it's already on the way back down, so it's finished its food and now it's turning into a kind of a liquidy texture again because it's finished eating. But we have growth, so that's amazing. So we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to discard and then we're going to feed. Now I know some people say that you can complete a starter in 7 days and it may appear that way, but your starter is still 2 weeks. So I recommend not trying to use it now and instead just keep up this regimen of discarding and feeding until you hit day 10 and then we can have a look. So I'm going to do that for the next couple of days and see if we can bake with it at the end of it. Okay, it's still the 7th day. I fed this a little while ago As you can see, there's a lot of activity, but it's not ready. Don't get too excited, but stay somewhat excited because you're almost there. Okay, day 8. Our starter from yesterday had overflowed on the counter overnight, so I'm switching out the container to a bigger one. So I'm pouring in, just as we do, 50 grams of starter, 50 water, 50 flour, and get rid of the rest. Then, of course, as usual, we're going to mark our container, cover it up, and put it on the counter for 24 hours. See you tomorrow. Day 9. You can see over the past 24 hours, it grew up to here, so it is tripling. Then it finished its food and fell back down, so it's nice and liquidy. So same thing for the next few days, discard, feed every 24 hours, and I'll see you in a few days. Okay, it's been a few days. It's now day 12, and it's been rising and falling over the past few days very nicely. So we're going to try to make some bread. So the first thing you have to do when you make some bread is you've got to feed your starter. So this one was fed yesterday, and as you can see, it's out of food and very liquidy. So I'm just like we've been doing, I'm just going to pour 50 grams of starter in here and feed it 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. And then we'll be back when the starter comes to peak. So instead of it falling, we're going to take our starter and have a look at it once it reaches the peak of its growth. Okay, it's been a few hours and it has grown to almost the top of the jar. So our starter is active and ready to use. Sometimes I use my starter even when it's on its way down, but this is pretty much the ideal point to use your starter. First, though, we have to see if it passes the float test. The idea is you drop a bit of starter in some water, and if it does not sink, it is ready to bake with. So it's called the float test. So if it floats, you should be able to bake with it. So I'm just putting a little bit here in the container, and there we go. So it is floating. So we're going to try to bake. Now the recipe I'm using for this bake is in the link above or in the description below. Okay, so the recipe I'm using calls for 100 grams of active starter. So that's what we're going to do with our starter. We don't have to build 11. Some recipes call for you to build 11, basically an offshoot of your starter. We're just going to use our straight starter and put it in here. So I'm going to need 100 grams of this, and then I'm going to finish putting in the rest of the ingredients, and I'll be back with either a flop or a successful bake. Let's see how strong our little yeasties are. Now, by using my starter in my recipe, just as it is, that's basically discard. So now I can use this in my bread, and then I just have to feed the remainder that's in here. See, there's just a little bit in here left, and that's okay. That's all we need. We just have to feed it our 50-50, and it'll start to grow again. Alternatively, if you're sick of feeding it, you can give it a feed and then put it in the fridge for up to a couple of weeks. Putting it in the fridge and the cold air in there makes the little yeasties kind of go dormant, and you don't have to worry about it for up to 2 weeks until you want to bake again. Okay, I'll be back when it's done. Okay, I'm about 3 hours into making sourdough, and as you can see here, we've got some bubble activity going on, so it's looking good. As you can see, our dough looks a lot bigger. It has almost doubled. Now there's a lot of activity underneath. You can see there's a lot of bubbling activity through the glass, and so it's ready to shape. Now, because our starter is so young, it is important to not pay attention to bulk proofing times in recipes. Your young starter may take a little more time to proof your dough, so just follow the dough, not the clock. Okay, I'm going to just speed things up here because I have other videos to show you how to shape. But I'm just shaping it here, and then I'm putting it in the proofing basket, and then it's going to go in the refrigerator for its cold ferment. Now that the cold ferment is done, I'm just going to score it, and we're going to put it in the oven. And here it is. Proof that you can easily build your own starter from scratch and make your own delicious sourdough. Be sure to check out my step-by-step video on making sourdough bread using your new starter. I hope you found this video helpful, and thank you so much for watching.